September 2024. 50 African presidents board planes. But they're not flying to Washington, London, or Paris. They're flying to Beijing. And what happened in that room will reshape the next century. But here's what they're not telling you. China doesn't need to invade Africa. They already own it. The media calls it investment. Politicians call it partnership, but follow the money, and you'll see something else entirely. Because while everyone was debating them whether this was good or bad, China was executing a playbook, step by step, country by country, resource by resource. And by the time anyone noticed what was happening, it was already too late. This is the story of how you buy a continent without firing a single shot. And it starts with a pattern you've seen before. Let me show you something. In 2024, Africa sold China $99 billion worth of goods. Sounds like a thriving partnership, right? Here's what they sold: copper, cobalt, iron ore, crude oil, gold, raw materials. Now here's what China sold back to Africa: $179 billion worth of electronics, machinery, textiles, finished products. Wait, let me say that again. Africa exported $99 billion in ingredients. China sold them back $179 billion in finished meals. That's an $80 billion trade deficit. And if this pattern sounds familiar, that's because it is. It's the same pattern European colonizers used 150 years ago. Extract the raw materials, ship them home, manufacture the products, sell them back at a premium. The flags have changed, the methods haven't. But here's where it gets interesting. Because the trade imbalance, that's just the surface. What China is really after isn't on the ships, it's in the ground. And in 60 seconds, I'll show you exactly which resource they're controlling and why it's in your pocket right now. Since the year 2000, China has loaned African nations $182 billion. And unlike Western banks that fund schools or hospitals, China focuses on one thing: infrastructure that moves resources. Ports, railways, roads, the arteries of trade. But here's the playbook you need to understand, because once you see it, you'll see it everywhere. Step 1. Offer the loan. In 2011, Ethiopia needed a railway to connect their capital to the ocean. China offered to build it. $4 billion. State-of-the-art. Electrified. Ethiopia couldn't afford it. No problem. China loaned them the money. Step 2. Lock in the terms. Ethiopia signed a 10-year loan at interest. But here's what they didn't calculate. The railway wouldn't generate enough revenue to pay back the debt. By 2018, Ethiopia owed China $14 billion, half of their entire foreign debt. Step 3. Extend the trap. When Ethiopia couldn't pay, China didn't seize the railway. That would look bad. Instead, they graciously restructured the loan from 10 years to 30 years. Now, Ethiopia isn't just in debt. They're locked in for a generation, paying interest on interest, while China controls the railway, the ports, and the infrastructure. Kenya borrowed $5 billion for their railway. Today, they're paying over $1 billion per year in debt service. That's 67% of their government revenue. The International Monetary Fund says you shouldn't spend more than 30% on debt. Kenya is spending double that on one railway to one country. But the railways aren't the end game. They're just the delivery system. Because what China is really after is what's moving on those trains. Take out your phone. Look at it. That phone has a battery, and that battery has cobalt in it. Now let me tell you who controls that cobalt. The Democratic Republic of Congo has 70% of the world's cobalt. Not 10%, not 25%, 70%. And Chinese companies control 80% of the DRC's cobalt production. Let that sink in. China controls more than half of the world's cobalt supply. The same cobalt in your phone, your laptop, your electric vehicle, your renewable energy storage. But they're not just buying the cobalt, they're controlling how it leaves the country. Remember those railways China built? Those ports they invested in? This is what they're for. You mine the cobalt, but you ship it on China's railway, through China's port, at China's prices, to China's refineries. It's vertical integration on a continental scale. In Zambia, Chinese mining companies just committed another $5 billion through 2031. Across Africa, China invested $7 billion in copper and cobalt mining in 2024 alone. Not to help Africa develop, to control the supply chain of the future. Because here's what they figured out. The future runs on batteries. Batteries run on cobalt and copper. And whoever controls those minerals doesn't just control Africa, they control the entire global energy transition. While the West was debating climate policy, China was buying the minerals the green economy needs to function. But controlling resources is only half the strategy, because China also needs to control where those resources can go. And that's where the ports come in. Here's a number you need to remember: 78. That's how many of Africa's 231 ports are now controlled by Chinese state-owned companies. That's 1/3 of the continent. West Africa, 35 Chinese port projects. East Africa, 17 ports. Southern Africa, 15 ports. But 3 ports tell you everything you need to know about the strategy. Lekki Port in Nigeria. Cost, $1 billion. China Harbor. Engineering owns 52.5% and operates it for 45 years. This port handles 1.2 million containers annually. It serves the Dangote refinery, Africa's largest. And every container that moves through it generates revenue that flows to Beijing. Djibouti, the military checkmate. But this one is genius. Djibouti, a tiny country on the Horn of Africa. Population, 1 million. Strategic value, infinite. Because Djibouti sits on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the entrance to the Red Sea, which means it controls the shipping lane between Asia, Europe, and Africa. 30% of the world's shipping containers pass through this strait. In 2017, China built their first overseas military base here. Not in Asia, not near Taiwan. In Djibouti, 90 acres, $600 million, 450-meter dock, helicopter hangars, armed personnel. And it's located exactly 7 miles from the U.S. military base Camp Lemonnier. China doesn't just control the commercial port, they have a military presence at one of the world's most strategic choke points, Port of Abidjan in Ivory Coast. China funded 85% of the $934 million expansion. It's Beijing's largest single port investment in Africa. 3 ports, 3 strategies: commercial dominance, military presence, infrastructure control. But even controlling the resources in the ports isn't enough, because China also built the network that connects them all, and that's where it gets dystopian. While everyone was focused on ports and railways, something else was happening, something quieter, something you can't see. China was building Africa's internet. Huawei built 70% of Africa's 4G backbone. Right now, 30 telecom operators in 17 African countries are launching 5G networks, most of them built by Huawei and ZTE. Chinese companies have laid hundreds of thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cables across the continent. They didn't just invest in Africa's digital infrastructure, they are Africa's digital infrastructure. And here's what that means. When you control the physical infrastructure, the cables, the towers, the routers, you can see everything that moves through it. Every transaction, every communication, every piece of data. Western intelligence agencies have been sounding alarms for years about surveillance capabilities embedded in Chinese hardware. But it's already too late. The infrastructure is already built. China doesn't need to hack into Africa's internet. They built it. They control it. They can see it all. So let's add it up. China controls the resources, the railways, the ports, the internet. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it's the one that makes it impossible to escape. September 4th, 2024, Beijing. 50 African heads of state sit in an auditorium. Not 5, not 15. 50. President Xi Jinping walks to the podium and announces $50.7 billion in new commitments to Africa over the next 3 years. That's a 25% increase from the last summit. 30 new infrastructure projects, zero tariffs for 33 of Africa's poorest countries. 30 joint science and technology laboratories. And every single leader in that room stood up and applauded, not because they love China, but because China is the only one who showed up with a checkbook. While the West cut foreign aid and focused inward, China wrote checks. While the West lectured about democracy and human rights, China built ports and didn't ask questions. No conditions about elections, no lectures about corruption, just here's $5 billion, sign here. In 2024, China invested $1.8 billion in Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2025, $61.2 billion. That's a 283% increase in 1 year. Nigeria alone is receiving $24.6 billion. The Republic of Congo, $23 billion. These aren't investments. This is a takeover. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say. Africa doesn't see this as a debt trap. They see it as the only option anyone gave them. So let me connect all the dots for you. China loans you money for infrastructure. You can't pay it back. They extend the terms and lock you in for 30 years. While you're in debt, they build the ports that ship your resources, the railways that move them, the digital networks that monitor everything. They control the cobalt in your phone, the copper in your electronics, the infrastructure that moves them, and the data that flows through it all. And when 50 African leaders fly to Beijing, not Washington, you know the shift is complete. This isn't colonialism with guns. It's colonialism with leverage, and it's happening right now. So the next time you charge your phone, remember, someone controls where that battery came from. Someone controls the infrastructure that shipped it. Someone controls the data moving through it. And that someone isn't who you think. So here's my question for you. Is this economic development or economic colonialism 2.0? Drop your answer in the comments. I actually read them, and if this opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the headlines, hit subscribe. Because next week, I'm showing you the one thing that could stop China's strategy in its tracks and why the West is already too late. The stories they're not telling you, those are the ones that matter most.